Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. They called it the Mirror Room, a congressional hearing room not for what it contained, but for what it revealed. Beneath the cold fluorescence and polished stone, this chamber had a reputation. Everything said here echoed louder, cut deeper, and reflected not only truth, but the biases hiding beneath polished rhetoric. On this particular morning, the room pulsed with anticipation. The subject was freedom, personal liberties, selective enforcement, and the growing shadow of racial disparity in the American justice system. But everyone knew beneath the official agenda, something far more volatile was about to erupt. At the center of it all sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, composed, poised, and unmistakably unafraid. Her skin gleamed like polished mahogany under the lights, her tailored black blazer sharp against the white of the walls. But it was her eyes that drew the most attention. Clear, defiant, framed by long black lashes that refused to bow, like shields guarding a truth too long ignored. In a room where women like her were still treated as visitors rather than architects, she didn't ask for space. She occupied it. Every move, every breath, felt like a protest wrapped in grace. Directly across from her sat Marjorie Greene, draped not in policy, but in performance. She leaned back with the smugness of someone used to hearing her own voice echo, hands resting on arms like a judge waiting to strike. Greene wasn't here to deliberate. She was here to provoke, to diminish, to remind everyone that power, in her world, still looked a certain way. She eyed Jasmine not like a colleague, but like an intruder. And in that moment, the hearing stopped being about justice. It became a battlefield, one side armed with facts and history, the other with ego and venom. And the whole nation was about to witness the collision. The silence between them, thin as glass, was about to crack. And when it did, it would cut deep. Jasmine had just begun to speak, her voice calm, measured, the kind of tone forged by years of being interrupted, but never silenced. "If we're going to be honest about freedom," she began, "we have to admit it's not the same for everyone. Some people get off with a warning. Others go to jail for doing the same thing." She gestured lightly toward the file in front of her, filled with statistics and case studies. And that's not random. It has a lot to do with skin color, where someone lives, and the assumptions people make before anyone speaks. But before she could finish the thought, Greene leaned forward with a sneer. The interruption came swift and sharp, like a slap across a sentence. "I think your fake eyelashes are messing with your reading comprehension." The words seemed small on the surface, almost trivial, but they fell into the room like a boulder into still water, sending invisible shockwaves through every wall, every breath, every bone. In an instant, the energy shifted. Aides froze mid-sentence. Reporters dropped pens, and even the marble walls seemed to draw in tighter, recoiling from the venom laced in those few syllables. It wasn't simply about lashes. It wasn't about makeup. It was about undermining intellect, erasing professionalism, reducing a black woman, to a caricature crafted by centuries of spite. The insult didn't strike Jasmine's skin. It drove into the history etched into her very existence, into a legacy of being judged not by words spoken, but by hair texture, skin tone, facial features deemed too much. Around them, time itself seemed to stutter and hold. There was no rustle of papers, no tapping of keys, no coughs from bored attendees, only a thick, almost suffocating silence, as if the mirror room itself understood that something sacred had just been violated. In the architecture of this imagined space, a massive pane of crystal-clear glass, built of unspoken respect in the fragile premise of equality, suddenly cracked. Not a surface crack, but a deep, groaning fracture that ran jagged from one invisible corner to another, splitting the room into a before and after. The message Greene sent was clear. Not only did she question Jasmine's arguments, she questioned her capacity to reason, her right to be taken seriously at all. It was a lunge not just at policy points, but at personhood, a blow meant to diminish, humiliate, and dehumanize under the camouflage of a joke. And the worst injustice was how familiar it was. how easily cruelty could be masked as just a comment, and how often the burden fell on the wounded to rise above it without making too much noise. But instead of giving Greene the reaction she craved, Jasmine gave the room something far heavier, a silence that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. She didn't blink, didn't move, didn't even flinch. Instead, she lowered her eyes slowly, as if the room itself had become too loud to look at. Her fingers, steady but tense, slid across the surface of the table and came to rest on the thick DOJ file she had brought with her, its edges marked, its pages flagged, its spine worn from nights of research. She didn't clutch it. She didn't use it as a shield. She simply touched it gently, with the kind of reverence you reserve for things that carry more than just paper, things that carry names, families, injustices. She took in one long, controlled breath through her nose and let it out through her mouth, her body still as stone. She wasn't fighting to control her anger. She was choosing to honor it differently, not with fire, but with memory. And in that moment, her mind slipped from the sterile cold of the hearing room to a burning Dallas sidewalk over 20 years ago. She was 10. Her mother, Clara, had spent that whole morning getting ready. Jasmine still remembered how carefully she'd pressed her white blouse, how she dabbed on lipstick in the mirror of their tiny apartment. Not too bright, just enough to look professional. Her heels clicked with pride when she walked. Jasmine had believed back then that if you looked nice and worked hard, people would treat you with respect. But standing outside that upscale salon, she learned something else. Clara walked in with a smile and a portfolio full of stunning hairstyles, box braids, silk presses, wedding updos, sculpted buns, years of work captured in glossy photos. But within 30 seconds, Jasmine saw the woman at the desk look her mother up and down, lips tight, eyes blank. And then she said it, quiet but clear. "Sorry, we're not hiring right now." Clara didn't argue. She just nodded once and turned around slowly, trying to keep her shoulders from falling. Jasmine met her at the door, and she could see it in her mother's eyes. That look of swallowing something bitter again. But what hurt the most wasn't the rejection. It was the lie. Because just 5 minutes later, another woman, white, blonde, with barely a folder in hand, walked in and got the job on the spot. Jasmine saw it with her own eyes. Clara said nothing. They just walked home together in silence, her heels suddenly too loud against the pavement. And in that silence, Jasmine made a silent vow she would carry with her forever. They will never look at me like that without hearing what I have to say. The memory burned behind her eyes, but when Jasmine opened them again, she didn't bring back pain. She brought something sharper, heavier, the unshakable calm of someone who knew exactly who she was. Her lashes lifted first, slow and deliberate, not trembling with rage, but standing tall with the weight of resolve. She sat up straighter in her chair, the leather groaning quietly beneath her, as if even the furniture knew the temperature of the room had changed. Greene was still smirking across from her, basking in the false triumph of her cheap insult. But Jasmine didn't look at her. Not yet. She let the silence stretch, let it grow heavy enough that even those trying to avoid eye contact could feel its pressure sink into their skin. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, not sharp, but smooth and deadly. The kind of calm that signals a storm has decided exactly where to strike. "If my intelligence is so fragile," Jasmine said, her words falling into the air like iron weights, "that a little makeup could threaten it." She let the pause stretch, razor thin and electric, before continuing, her gaze locking onto Greene with a force that could split mountains. "Then maybe what you're really afraid of isn't my lashes at all. It's what I'm about to say next." The words didn't erupt in rage. They landed with a heavy finality, like a gavel striking the end of a long, crooked trial. And for the first time since the attack, it was Greene who shifted uncomfortably, realizing too late that she had not silenced Jasmine Crockett. She had only unleashed her. And just like that, with one sentence, Jasmine didn't just reclaim her dignity. She put the truth on trial. She didn't glance back at Greene. She didn't even blink in her direction. Instead, Jasmine reached forward with calm, deliberate precision and flipped open the thick DOJ report that had been sitting silently between them the entire hearing. The weight of it alone sent a subtle message. Hundreds of pages, months of investigation, years of pain captured in black ink and hard numbers. She didn't pound the table. She didn't shout. She tapped a single page, then lifted her eyes to meet the panel. "This," she said, her voice level and quiet, "is what it looks like when a system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do." The room didn't move. No one shifted in their chairs. No one coughed or whispered, because Jasmine had just flipped the hearing upside down, and now every pair of eyes was glued to her, not out of politeness, but necessity. She turned the first page. "Mississippi," she began, "over 400 cases reviewed, and black defendants received sentences 30 to 40% longer than white defendants for the same offenses. Not similar, the same. Same charges, same history, different skin." Her tone never wavered. She turned another page. "In Georgia," she continued, "a single district attorney charged 12 black teenagers as adults for nonviolent drug crimes over a 4-year period. During that same period, not one white minor faced adult prosecution. Not one." Flip. In Louisiana, where Congresswoman Greene once praised the strict and fair judges on record, she paused slightly here, letting the irony linger. Multiple public defenders testified that black clients were pressured into plea deals under threat of longer sentences, even when evidence was weak or non-existent. The pages made no sound as they turned, but every word Jasmine spoke landed like a drumbeat. She wasn't reading, she was revealing, line by line, state by state, the anatomy of an injustice no one in that room could pretend not to see anymore. She turned to Alabama next, lifting a tab section. 2 judges still sitting on the bench today were exposed for using coded racial slurs in official email chains. They were investigated internally. No charges, no suspensions, no apologies. They're still wearing the robe. Her hand didn't shake as she said it. Her voice didn't crack. But the air around her had grown so still, it felt like the entire chamber was holding its breath. And it wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, with restraint, with clarity, with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing the truth is finally louder than the insult. She paused, then slowly closed the folder. "These aren't opinions," she said, her voice just above a whisper now, but somehow stronger than before. "They're patterns, and patterns don't lie. People do." And as Jasmine closed the last page of the DOJ report, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was charged, volatile, like the air just before a lightning strike. The silence wasn't polite anymore. It was heavy, stretched, almost painful, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. No one moved. No one dared. Because for the first time in that room, truth didn't come dressed in a tailored gray suit with polished shoes and a neutral tone. It came wrapped in brown skin, framed by long black lashes and delivered in a voice too calm to ignore. Jasmine didn't need to yell. She didn't need to provoke. Her presence alone had done what years of memos and ignored reports couldn't. It made people look up, listen, and feel. The facts she read had been buried in inboxes, filed away in footnotes, brushed off in panels where the only people allowed to speak were the ones never affected by the injustice. But now those same facts had found a body. A woman who didn't just read the numbers. She carried the weight of them in her own family, her own skin, her own lived experience. It wasn't just what she said. It was that someone like her was saying it, and saying it without flinching. The people in the room weren't just hearing data. They were being confronted by the reality that for the first time, the voice of justice didn't sound like theirs. And that terrified them more than any report ever could. Because when truth comes with lashes, with gloss, with a name like Jasmine Crockett, it forces the question no one wanted to answer. What if the system isn't broken, just designed to ignore people like her? And just when it seemed the truth had finally claimed the room, Greene reached again. Not for clarity, but for cruelty. She leaned forward in her chair, tapping her manicured nail against the polished wood as if bored. Her voice dripping with that same artificial sweetness used to dress up contempt. "B6, she said, tilting her head with mock curiosity, her smirk widening. What is that? A new makeup shade? A few in the room blinked. No one laughed. Not even her own aides dared meet her eyes. It was a cheap line, but it was delivered with the confidence of someone who had been rewarded their whole life for making pain look like punchlines. What she had just heard, the statistics, the cases, the patterns of injustice, hadn't been challenged, couldn't be denied. So instead, she did what power always tries to do when it's cornered: reduce it, minimize it, turn it into something small and shallow, something disposable like eyeliner or blush. Greene wasn't asking a question. She was swinging at dignity with sarcasm, trying to yank the room back to where truth didn't matter. Only image did. But this time, the air didn't bend to her. It held, heavy and unmoved, because everyone in that room knew what she was doing. And for the first time, her voice, sharp, smug, and familiar, sounded less like authority and more like fear pretending to be in control. For a long moment, Greene's words hung in the air, empty and sour, and then Jasmine smiled. For a long moment, Greene's words hung in the air, empty and sour, and then Jasmine smiled. It wasn't a forced smile. It wasn't bitter or shaken. It was quiet, composed, and unshakably sure. The kind of smile that didn't beg for validation, but delivered warning. Jasmine didn't rush. She sat in the silence Greene had created with her own mockery and let it ferment just long enough to become unbearable. And when she spoke, her voice was low, smooth, and steady, but every word landed like a verdict. B6, she said, turning slightly in her chair so both the cameras and the committee could see her, isn't makeup. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was surgical, as if she were placing a scalpel exactly where it needed to go. It's Section B6 of the Department of Justice's Pattern or Practice Investigations, the provision that outlines evidence of systemic discrimination in courts, policing, and sentencing. Her fingers tapped the DOJ file gently, as if to remind the room that everything she was saying was already on record. And today, she continued, meeting Greene's gaze directly for the first time since the insult, B6 has a face. The pause that followed didn't come from hesitation. It came from control. And then, with perfect precision, she finished. It's mine. The room didn't gasp. It exhaled. Suddenly, collectively, like everyone had been holding their breath and didn't realize it until that moment. Chairs creaked as people shifted forward without meaning to. A reporter's pen stopped mid-word. Even the low hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to pull back, as if silence itself needed to make room for what had just been said. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't snapped or mocked back, but she had flipped the power dynamic in a way that couldn't be undone. She had taken a legal clause, one buried in bureaucratic language, and turned it into something human, something visible, something no one in that room could now unsee. She had taken a number, a section, a code, and turned it into flesh and truth and challenge. And in doing so, she hadn't just answered Greene. She had reframed the entire hearing. Across the room, Greene's smirk faltered for the first time. Not in shame, that emotion was too distant for her, but in confusion. Her face tightened slightly, the muscles around her eyes pulling inward, like someone trying to understand how they had lost control of a conversation they had started. But Jasmine wasn't watching for a reaction. She didn't need one. The statement wasn't for Greene. It was for everyone who had ever been told to quiet down, to sit back, to blend in. For everyone who had ever been dismissed, diminished, or discredited because of how they looked or spoke or prayed or wore their hair. Jasmine had put a mirror in front of them all, and for the first time, the reflection wasn't polished and polite. It was raw, undeniable, and wearing lashes, Greene thought she could laugh away. The moment rippled far beyond the hearing room. In the press box, one reporter mouthed the words, "She said B6 has a face," as if confirming it for their own notes, or maybe to make sure they hadn't imagined it. A producer at a news network clipped the quote instantly and fired it off to the control room. Inside minutes, it would scroll across television screens nationwide. And online, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, the phrase ignited like dry grass to a match. The hashtag was simple, powerful, and impossible to ignore. B6 has a face. Within half an hour, it was trending across every major platform. People began posting their own photos. Young black women holding DOJ reports, law students writing the clause number across their notebooks, activists sharing footage of Jasmine's lines synced with music, dubbed over courtroom footage like it belonged in a movie. But it wasn't a movie, it was real, and it was happening now. Back in the hearing room, no one interrupted her. No one tried to cut in. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't push. She let the moment breathe. Let it settle like dust into every fold of power and privilege in that space. She knew better than to speak again. She had said enough. The force of her words came not from volume, but from clarity, from the kind of truth that didn't knock the door down, but unlocked it and waited for people to walk through. Even the chairman, normally quick to regain order, sat still for a beat too long, as if unsure whether to speak or stand, or simply acknowledge that something irreversible had just taken place. And Jasmine sat quietly, letting it all happen around her. Composed, centered. The living proof that B6 was no longer just policy. It was presence. She didn't look around the room for reactions. She didn't need to. Her job was never to please anyone in that room. Her job was to speak what was real and let the weight of it fall where it may. She had come into that hearing already knowing the system wouldn't want to hear her voice. She came anyway. And when she was mocked, she didn't fold. She clarified. When they tried to turn her into a punchline, she turned the table. And when the moment came to define who controlled the conversation, she didn't just take it, she redefined it. Because in that moment, under fluorescent lights in front of stone faces and frozen cameras, truth had long black lashes. Truth wore a gold cross. Truth didn't yell, and truth didn't ask permission. It sat, smiled, and said, "It's me." And while the room echoed with the impact of her words, Jasmine knew this wasn't the first time someone had tried to make her smaller for simply showing up in her own skin. She had long since stopped being surprised by the way people reacted to her appearance, not because she didn't care, but because she had grown used to power disguising itself as critique. She remembered the press conference clearly. Bright lights, a crowded chamber, and one reporter, press suit and smug grin, who waited until the end of the briefing to ask his question. Not about her policy, not about her bill, but about her look. "Representative Crockett," he said, leaning forward just enough to make it performative. "Some have said your style is a little loud for Capitol Hill. Is that intentional?" The air had shifted immediately. She saw the way aides paused mid-note, how even seasoned correspondents raised eyebrows, unsure whether to look at her or at their feet. Jasmine hadn't flinched. She had smiled. But it wasn't the smile of someone amused. It was the smile of someone who had spent her entire career being reduced to an outfit before being respected for an argument. "Intentional?" she repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air like smoke. "Yes, just like the way I read every line of every bill before I put my name on it." The room hadn't clapped, but the silence afterward was louder than any applause. Because deep down, they knew what had just happened. A woman had refused to shrink, and instead stood up taller, in heels. That wasn't the only time it happened. On the campaign trail, it had been worse. At a town hall in East Texas, she'd shaken hands for nearly an hour, answered questions about infrastructure, voting rights, and housing reform, only to have a man pull her aside afterward and say, "You're smart, no doubt, but you might be a better fit for television than for office. Too polished, too much." He'd smiled like it was a compliment. She'd smiled like it wasn't. Another voter, a middle-aged woman with a party pin and perfect pearls, once told a reporter in earshot, "I like her fire, but she's a branding problem. She looks more like an Instagram personality than a public servant." That quote had made it into 3 local articles. One outlet even used it as a headline. "Crockett, a style star, but can she lead?" They never asked that about men with pocket squares or custom-tailored suits. They never questioned the seriousness of those who wore power the way they were told to. But for Jasmine, every accessory, every red nail, every gold earring, every flick of her lashes was seen as a signal that she was playing dress-up in a space not built for her. But she never changed. She never softened her walk or dimmed her colors. She drafted bills in full glam. She cross-examined officials with crimson nails tapping legal pads. She stood on courthouse steps in power suits and platform heels because she didn't believe professionalism meant invisibility. When critics called her style distracting, she wrote stronger legislation. When donors whispered that her look might alienate moderates, she won votes in counties they thought she'd never touch. She protected tenants from eviction, secured public defense funding, and tore through policy loopholes while wearing lashes they said were too long. Because for Jasmine, there was never a line between what she wore and what she stood for. Both were armor, both were hers, and both had every right to take up space in the halls of power. She knew that to some, her presence felt like disruption, but to her it was restoration. Not a challenge to the system, but a correction to the story it told about who belonged inside it. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from having to prove twice as much, just to be called half as capable. Jasmine lived with that weight every day, and yet she never let it crush her. She used it, turned it into policy, into purpose, into presence. Every insult, every backhanded comment, every whisper that she was too flashy or not serious enough became fuel. Not for revenge, but for results. Because what her critics didn't understand was that she never needed their permission. She didn't ask to be invited in. She walked in on her own terms, unapologetically, unsoftened, and exactly as she was. And now, seated under fluorescent lights, having just turned a federal clause into a national headline, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a woman with long lashes and red nails. She was the embodiment of everything the system tried to mute and couldn't. She wasn't there to blend in. She was there to be seen, fully, clearly. And finally, after years of being told to tone it down, she had made it undeniable. Style was never the distraction. It was the declaration. And while the courtroom slowly exhaled, outside its walls, the real eruption had already begun. It started with a single photo, a grainy, unfiltered selfie taken by a college student in Atlanta, her eyes framed by long, curled lashes, a caption written in bold defiance. "For the record, mine are real. But even if they weren't, they'd still hold truth. Yeah, my lashes speak truth." Within minutes, it was reposted hundreds of times. By the hour, thousands. By the end of the day, it had become a movement. Across the country, women, especially Black women, began flooding timelines with their own photos, stories, and scars. Some were lawyers in power suits. Some were high school girls in uniforms. Some were hairstylists in small-town salons holding DOJ printouts beside handheld mirrors. All of them had the same message. I am not too much. I am not the distraction. I am the witness. The phrase took flight not because it was clever, but because it was earned. Forged in a moment when one woman, under attack, refused to bend and instead turned mockery into meaning. The hashtag spread like wildfire because it wasn't about beauty, it was about battle. A history of being told to tone it down, to look more professional, to blend in. But now blending in was no longer the goal. Being seen was. Teachers in Detroit wore their lashes bold the next morning, even the ones who usually kept it subtle, taking photos at their desks with lesson plans in one hand and the hashtag in the other. Baristas in Oakland wore red lipstick and gold hoops under their visors. Nursing students in Baltimore posed in hospital scrubs, holding up copies of B6 policy pages taped to their clipboards. A woman in Jackson, Mississippi wrote, "They mocked her lashes, but her lashes held more law than the man in the robe." And with each post, something unspoken was being rewritten. An entire generation of women no longer apologizing for showing up full. In Chicago, a nail tech named Kiara gathered her clients for a group photo. 7 Black women, all wearing long lashes and holding signs that read, DOJ Section B6, ask me about it. In New York, a group of middle school girls recreated Jasmine's courtroom pose for a civics class project, presenting a slideshow on systemic bias and media framing. One girl added a final slide with her own quote, "If lashes can carry truth, so can I." On a bus in Dallas, a grandmother leaned over to her granddaughter, pointed at Jasmine's photo in the news app on her phone, and whispered, This is why I told you to never let them shame your shine. And in that single moment, the power of it crystallized. This wasn't just trending. It was transforming. The backlash came, of course, as it always does. Pundits called it performative. Anonymous commenters said it was focusing on the wrong things. One cable anchor sarcastically asked, "What's next? Hashtags about eyeliner." But the momentum didn't flinch, because this time the answer wasn't defensive, it was declarative. Yes, if it starts with eyeliner, if it starts with lashes and leads to truth, then so be it. Let it start there. Let it start with what they mock. Let it start with what they underestimate. Because the point was never about lashes. The point was about who gets to tell the truth and how much dignity they're allowed to bring with them when they do. Even in spaces that once stayed silent, something shifted. Congressional aides who'd never worn extensions began doing so in quiet solidarity. Legal scholars cited Jasmine's hearing in op-eds titled, "The Optics of Power When Appearance Becomes Protest." The DOJ's public download numbers for Section B6 tripled in less than 48 hours. And quietly in cities across the country, law school applications from Black women spiked. Not because Jasmine had asked them to, but because she had reminded them they never needed permission. It wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror. And the country, for once, was forced to see not just the policy, but the person. Not just the clause, but the courage. And through every phone screen, classroom, cubicle, and courthouse, that image echoed again and again. Jasmine Crockett, lashes long, eyes steady, voice clear, making history not in spite of how she looked, but with it. For every time someone said too loud, too bold, too extra, too much, she had offered something no insult could crush, a vision of leadership that didn't shrink to fit the room, one that dared to fill it. Because sometimes the most radical act isn't just telling the truth, it's doing it with red nails and lashes they swore would never be taken seriously until the whole nation stopped and listened. While hashtags surged and salons became safe havens of solidarity, the people at the center of the storm made very different choices. Greene vanished. One day she was everywhere, smirking into microphones, issuing sound bites designed to stir rage or laughter, and the next she was nowhere to be found. Reporters waited outside her office, but the blinds stayed drawn. She skipped her next scheduled appearance on a right-wing morning show. Her press team released a cold, vague statement about partisan theater, but she herself said nothing. Her silence didn't come from humility, it came from strategy, the quiet calculation of someone trying to wait out a firestorm without fanning it. But the silence spoke louder than any spin. And in contrast, on the other side of the chaos, Jasmine Crockett was receiving so much mail, her staff had to rent temporary storage space to hold it. Over 50,000 messages poured in, not from politicians or donors or talking heads, but from women, mothers, daughters, teachers, stylists, judges, janitors, students, all of them reaching for her voice like a lifeline and writing as if they'd been waiting years for permission to finally say what they felt. The letters came in boxes, the emails in thousands. The social media messages scrolled for hours without end. Many were brief. "Thank you." Some were angry. "I've lived this too, and I'm tired of pretending it's not real." Others were stories, vivid, painful, glorious, of women who had spent their entire lives being told to be less. One woman from Ohio wrote, "My first boss told me I'd get promoted faster if I wore beige instead of red. I wore red the next day. Thank you for making me feel like I wasn't wrong." A former judge from Michigan admitted she had stayed silent for years, afraid of losing respect for not looking the part, and ended her letter with, "Not anymore." And in the middle of the pile, tucked into a small purple envelope with stickers along the edges, was a handwritten note from a 13-year-old girl in Mississippi. The handwriting was careful, like someone who had erased and rewritten many lines. It began simply, "Dear Congresswoman Crockett, my name is Anya, and I saw you on TV with my mom. You made me feel proud to look like me." Jasmine sat in her office long after sunset, reading the letter with the city lights flickering behind her like distant camera flashes. Her team had left for the night. The room was quiet, But in her hands, she held something louder than any applause she'd received. Ania's words continued. Sometimes I feel like I talk too loud or wear too much lip gloss and people laugh. But when you talked, nobody laughed. They listened. You said B6 had a face, and it was you. But it kind of felt like it was me too. Jasmine paused, blinking back something fierce and full behind her eyes. The letter ended with a single sentence, written larger than the rest. I want to be a lawyer when I grow up, and keep my long lashes, just like you. It hit her like a quiet explosion. Not with fire, but with gravity. Not because of the praise, but because she understood exactly what it meant to be that girl. To wonder if the very things that made you feel beautiful were the same things keeping others from hearing your brilliance. To have power in you and still feel like you had to edit yourself to make it palatable. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, still holding the letter, and remembered being 13. Writing essays about Thurgood Marshall in the daytime and practicing eyeliner in the mirror at night. Not knowing yet that she could be both fierce and flawless and still be taken seriously. And now someone else was watching her and daring to believe the same. This wasn't the kind of victory that made headlines. There was no applause, no committee vote, no flashing, breaking news banner. But it was a victory just the same, maybe even the one that mattered more. Because policies change slowly. Courts bend over decades. But a 13-year-old girl deciding she doesn't have to hide to be taken seriously? That's how generations turn. That's how the system loses its grip. Not all at once, but one brave voice at a time, echoing louder because someone dared to speak first. Jasmine folded the letter gently and placed it inside her desk drawer, beside a framed photo of her mother and a first draft of her equal sentencing reform bill. She didn't need a trophy. She had a letter from a girl who now believed she could be powerful without apology. Holding Ania's letter in her hands, Jasmine knew that inspiring one girl wasn't enough. Not when there were millions more still being told they had to shrink to succeed. She didn't wait for permission. She never had. The next morning, Jasmine Crockett walked into her press conference in Washington, not just as a congresswoman, but as a woman on a mission. The media had been buzzing since the night before. Rumors flying about an announcement, guesses ranging from a Senate run to a new podcast. No one expected what came next. Flanked by two staffers and dressed in a bold crimson blazer, she stood behind the podium, placed her hands down, and said with absolute clarity, "Every dollar earned from my new beauty collaboration, every single cent, will go to scholarships for Black girls who want to go to law school." The room, already humming with camera clicks, seemed to freeze. Some reporters blinked. Others raised their pens mid-sentence. Jasmine didn't pause. The collection is called the Clapback Collection. You've probably heard the word used like an insult to describe women who speak up, speak back, and speak out. But to us, it means survival. It means standing in our truth, even when they try to laugh us off the stage. Her voice was steady. Her tone was unshakable. And for the first time in a long time, every journalist in the room was forced to write faster just to keep up. The collection itself had gone viral overnight. Bold lashes named Section B6. Nail colors titled Testimony Red and Courtroom Gold. A line of hair products co-branded with Black-owned beauty labs and infused with quotes from the hearing. Not a distraction. A declaration. What began as a moment of defense had transformed into a movement of offense, reclaiming power not just in law books, but on vanities and bathroom counters across the country. And Jasmine didn't just lend her name to it. She designed it. She handpicked the shades. She wrote every quote on the packaging. Because she knew that in a world where appearance had always been used as a weapon to disqualify, to silence, to erase, it was time to weaponize joy, pride, and cultural identity in return. She smiled as the cameras flashed, not because she was proud of launching a product, but because she had finally turned the thing they mocked into a resource they couldn't touch. But she didn't stop there. After the press conference, Jasmine headed straight for the Capitol. With her staff close behind and a leather folder under her arm, she walked into the legislative chamber with the same determination she'd shown in courtrooms, protests, and budget hearings. She had learned early that you can't change a system by only surviving it. You have to confront it where it lives. And so she submitted a bill, bold, blunt, unapologetic. Its title printed in thick black font on the front, the Appearance Equity Act, the first of its kind. A federal measure designed to ban discrimination in the workplace based on hair texture, cultural hairstyles, nail color, religious garments, and traditional clothing. Everything that had been called unprofessional for generations, but never once proven to impact job performance. She stood at the clerk's desk, handed over the papers, and said aloud, "Because professionalism was never supposed to be a disguise for racism." She didn't need applause. She needed signatures. The journey to this bill had been written in microaggressions, in interviews where she was asked about her wardrobe instead of her legislation, in committee meetings where her voice was interrupted more than her white male colleagues combined, in articles that praised her feisty energy but never once mentioned her courtroom victories, in whispered comments from donors worried she wasn't relatable enough for suburban voters, in every hallway where power pretended not to see her, and every room she entered anyway. The Appearance Equity Act wasn't just a response to one insult. It was the accumulation of 1,000 moments of erasure that women like Jasmine had endured with a smile and a plan. And as the news broke, across cable channels, Twitter feeds, and university forums, the reaction was immediate. Labor organizations praised it. Civil rights groups endorsed it. Some corporations tried to stay neutral. Others panicked. But one video clip rose above the noise, Jasmine standing outside the Capitol steps, saying directly into the camera, "This bill isn't about making fashion political. It's about ending the lie that dignity only comes dressed in one color, one hair texture, one suit. The way we wear our identity is not a threat to your workplace. Your bias is." That sentence was played on every major network that night. It was played in classrooms. It was played in hair salons. It was even played during Sunday sermons in churches where girls once got sent home for wearing braids. Back in her office, Jasmine watched it all unfold with a quiet stillness. She didn't celebrate. She calculated. Because the truth was, passing the bill would be a battle. Hearings would come. Pushback would rise. Opponents would frame it as unnecessary, as symbolic, as divisive. But Jasmine had heard it all before, and this time, she wasn't coming to ask for understanding. She was coming with numbers, with voices, with legal firepower, and cultural momentum at her back. The world had watched her lashes flutter while she delivered federal indictment statistics. Now it would watch as she dismantled the coded language of professionalism, one policy at a time. Because in every corner of the country, girls were watching. Girls who had been pulled out of class for having twists. Girls whose job interviews ended the moment they walked in with a head wrap. Girls who had been told to be less before they were ever allowed to speak. Jasmine wasn't just legislating. She was translating every insult ever hurled at women like them and answering it with law, with policy, with purpose. And this time, no one could say it was just makeup. The bill had been filed, the cameras had faded, and the crowd had finally begun to thin. But for Jasmine Crockett, history was never made inside the hearing room. It was made in the moment you walked out, still standing tall. The sun was low when she stepped outside, casting everything in amber. The marble stairs, the Capitol dome behind her, the shoulders of the aides quietly following a few steps behind. The sky above Washington, D.C. burned in streaks of gold and violet, like the end of something monumental, or the beginning of something even bigger. Jasmine paused at the top of the steps, letting the air touch her skin, her eyes squinting slightly against the fading light. She didn't speak. She didn't rush. She simply stood there for a breath, arms relaxed, chin slightly raised, and let the wind move gently across her face. Her lashes didn't flutter. They held firm, like flags refusing to lower in the wind. Behind her, someone opened the heavy courthouse doors with a creak that sounded like the end of an era. Before her, waiting at the base of the stairs, were reporters, not just political journalists, but national press, students, activists, women holding phones instead of microphones. All of them waiting not for scandal, but for something far rarer: closure. The air was quiet but tight, like a bowstring drawn, not yet released. Jasmine began her descent, each step steady, heels clicking in rhythm with the heartbeat of a nation that had watched her fight with grace, sharp enough to slice through bias. Flashes began to pop again, not the hostile kind she had once braced for, but the kind that now tried to capture something bigger than a headline. She didn't slow down. She didn't perform. She simply walked, head held high, black coat fluttering behind her, like a cloak pulled straight from legend. No one called out questions at first. No one interrupted. There was something reverent about it. Something like watching a survivor exit the battlefield with her flag still raised. When she reached the final step and turned slightly toward the crowd, the silence cracked. It came from a young reporter in the front, maybe early 20s, press badge crooked on his jacket, voice a little too soft for the moment, but honest all the same. "Congresswoman Crockett," he called out, one hand raised half-heartedly. She stopped, tilted her head just slightly to let him speak. "Do you think," he asked, a smile creeping nervously across his face, "that your lashes made history today?" There was a beat, just a beat, where no one knew how to react. Some chuckled quietly. Others inhaled like they'd just heard a line too risky to ask aloud. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or wave it off. She looked directly at him and then beyond him, at the dozens of other faces watching, holding phones, waiting for something to remember. She smiled, not the practiced political smile, not the courtroom smirk. This one was real, slow, warm, and lined with steel. "No," she said, her voice soft enough to feel intimate, even among a crowd. "My lashes didn't write history." She paused there, on purpose. "History is written by those who refuse to bow their heads." And then she leaned in, eyes locked with the young man who asked it, lashes still casting long shadows under the golden sky. Even if they're wearing false ones. The moment froze. For 1 second the world held its breath. Then the crowd reacted. Not with applause, but with stunned, breathless awe. People lowered their phones like they'd just seen the final frame of a movie that would never leave them. The quote hit social media within seconds, already stamped across photos and headlines before Jasmine had even turned away. "History is written by those who don't bow, even in false lashes." The line wasn't just memorable. It was a weapon, a shield, a scripture. And she had said it with the kind of effortless calm that comes not from media training, but from surviving enough battles to know exactly how power bends when it's held by someone who knows what to do with it. She didn't linger after that. She nodded once, a quiet thank you, then turned and began walking again. Not hurried, not slow, just purposeful. Her team followed behind, speechless, reverent. One aide reached up to wipe her own cheek, caught between pride and something far heavier. The kind of emotion that only comes when you've seen a wall crack that you've spent your whole life trying to climb. Jasmine didn't look back. She didn't need to. Behind her, something had shifted permanently. A courtroom, a party, a country, and maybe, just maybe, a generation of girls who would now walk into their future wearing lashes. Not to impress anyone, but to remind themselves they never had to shrink to fit a system that was never built for them in the first place. Back inside the courthouse, someone would later find a copy of the DOJ file she had presented. It had been left on the bench, neatly closed but with a note on top. "Section B6 has a face now." The clerk who found it took a photo. That photo made the rounds too. It became another part of the story. A small one, quiet but powerful. Just like Jasmine's walked down those stairs. And somewhere, in classrooms, in dorm rooms, in family kitchens lit by television screens, in late-night news coverage, the moment replayed again and again. Not the insults, not the data, not the arguments, but the image of a woman walking out of the lion's den without a single part of herself dimmed. Still dressed how they said she shouldn't. Still speaking how they told her not to. Still seen, still standing, and still exactly who she had been the whole time. And maybe that was the most revolutionary thing of all. And as Jasmine disappeared into the golden light, heels steady on the pavement, and the final echoes of her words still hanging in the air, one truth remained. This was never just about lashes. This was about the long war between power and perception. and who gets to hold both at the same time. It was about how systems aren't always broken. Sometimes they're functioning exactly as designed, to elevate some and erase others. Jasmine's story exposed what happens when someone refuses to be erased. Not with anger, not with violence, but with intellect wrapped in elegance, and truth delivered through every fiber of her presence. It was about the weight of being too often told you're too much, too loud, too proud, too visible, and the miracle of standing tall anyway. It was about walking into rooms where you were never meant to sit, never meant to speak, and deciding to do both with red nails, long lashes, and evidence that can't be ignored. Jasmine didn't rewrite the rules. She held them up like a mirror and dared the system to look at itself. And when it did, even for a moment, the reflection cracked. The lesson was not that Jasmine triumphed despite being mocked. It was that she never let the mocking define the battlefield. She understood something bigger, that injustice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in boardrooms, disguises itself as dress codes, and hides behind language like professionalism or standards. She faced a wall that countless others had hit before, a wall of expectations, coded rules, and polite erasure. And she didn't just climb over it. She painted it, named it, and made sure everyone watching finally saw it for what it was. Because sometimes the fight isn't against what's said out loud. It's against the weight of everything people believe about you before you've spoken a single word. Jasmine spoke anyway, and in doing so she carved space not just for herself, but for thousands who had been edited out before the first page even turned. But the most radical message wasn't in her fight, it was in her refusal to change. Jasmine didn't dilute her tone, her dress, her rhythm, her identity, just to be palatable. She didn't trim herself down to fit a mold. She didn't meet the system in the middle. She walked in whole and demanded the system widen instead. That's what made her dangerous. That's what made her unforgettable. In a world that rewards assimilation, she chose authenticity, and not the sanitized kind. The kind with roots, scars, and sparkle. The kind that doesn't ask to be accepted, but arrives already enough. The kind that carries the story of a mother rejected for her skin tone, a daughter told to blend in, and a congresswoman who decided to rise anyway, with everything they told her to leave behind still intact. And in her rising, she reminded us that justice isn't sterile, it isn't colorless, it doesn't come in neutral tones or fit only inside court transcripts. Real justice is messy, it's loud, it wears hoops and speaks with rhythm and carries the scent of memory on its breath. Real justice feels like truth wrapped in pain that's finally been seen. Jasmine didn't just defend herself. She opened a door that had been welded shut and showed the world what walks through when you finally stop guarding it with bias. She reminded us that dignity isn't reserved for the quiet, that strength isn't found in silence, that leadership isn't one size fits all, and never was. The injustice she faced wasn't new, it was generational. It was written into dress codes, hiring practices, school suspensions, court decisions, and magazine covers that all quietly whispered, "Be less." But Jasmine's answer was a masterclass in being more. More present, more visible, more unwavering, more her. And in doing so, she reminded us that survival is only the beginning. What comes next? The power to speak, lead, inspire. That's where legacy lives. Her story wasn't about proving she belonged. It was about exposing the lie that said she didn't. And that lie cracked wide open the moment she turned an insult into a movement, a section code into a mirror, and a pair of lashes into a statement of defiance heard across the nation. But the true human message wasn't even about law. It was about visibility, about the quiet trauma of constantly shrinking yourself just to be allowed in, and the unimaginable relief of finally realizing you don't have to. Jasmine's message burned through every camera lens and transcript. You do not have to become invisible to be respected. You do not have to choose between your identity and your opportunity. You do not have to change to deserve to be heard. And you certainly don't have to apologize for taking up space. Not in a courtroom, not in a classroom, not in Congress, not anywhere. Especially not when the truth is on your side. And so the story doesn't end with a headline or a hashtag. It ends with a shift. A mother who finally wears her natural hair to work. A student who submits a college essay about her culture instead of hiding it. A teacher who lets her girls wear braids without fear of detention. A hiring manager who rethinks what professional really means. A girl in Mississippi who keeps her lashes long and her law books open because Jasmine made her believe she could do both. The message isn't that one woman changed everything. It's that one woman, by refusing to shrink, gave everyone else the courage to stop shrinking too. And that's the lesson. That power isn't something you're given. It's something you reclaim, breath by breath, step by step, word by word. That dignity isn't earned by compromise, but by conviction. That your full self, your hair, your voice, your fire, your truth, is not the price of entry. It's the proof that you belong. Jasmine didn't just survive injustice. She named it, faced it, outlived it, and when the moment came, she didn't flinch. She stood, and so should we. But legacies don't live in marble halls or social media trends. They live in what you choose to do next. So don't let this story end with her. Don't let the moment pass like another headline, another clip, another name whispered in a wave of outrage that dies down before anything changes. Stand in what she stood for. Call out the quiet bias. Challenge the dress codes. Ask why qualified still looks like one kind of face. Sit in the meetings they never thought you'd walk into. And when you speak, speak in your own voice, not the one they trained you to copy. Support legislation like the Appearance Equity Act. Write to your representatives. March when marching matters. Donate when dollars speak louder than hashtags, and vote like you're building a future where no one has to strip themselves to be seen as competent. Don't wait for someone to hand you the microphone. Walk to the front, take it, and tell your story. Even if your lashes are long, your nails are loud, or your truth shakes the room. Because the injustice Jasmine faced isn't hers alone. It's stitched into every office that polices hair before credentials, every court that labels dignity as attitude, every boardroom that demands invisibility in the name of professionalism, and it will keep breathing as long as we remain silent. So speak, not just in defense of yourself, but in defense of everyone who's ever been told to tone it down just to be taken seriously. Hold the mirror Jasmine held. Make them see what they're pretending not to. Make them explain why equality still comes with fine print. Write op-eds, organize panels, educate your HR departments, share stories that challenge the rules pretending to be neutral. When someone says, it's just appearance, ask them, then why are you so afraid of mine? And if you're tired of fighting to be heard, tired of being mistaken for the assistant in your own meeting, tired of doing everything right and still being treated like you don't belong, know this. Your exhaustion is not weakness. It is proof you have carried the weight they never had to. It is fuel. Use it. You are not alone. You are part of a rising chorus of voices that will no longer be silenced by policy, by culture, or by fear. And if you don't know where to begin, start where Jasmine did, by refusing to lower your head. Let them see your pride before your resume. Let them hear your truth before your title. Because what changes the world is not polished compliance. It's bold, visible courage. Support the women doing this work every day, the ones creating scholarship funds, mentoring law students, rewriting HR policy, sitting on diversity councils, and running for office with hair that breaks the mold. Share their work, amplify their wins, defend them when the backlash comes, because it always does. Join coalitions pushing for workplace equity. Push companies to back their DEI statements with action. Make space for those who've been pushed out and protect the ones walking in behind you. Because progress isn't just about breaking doors down. It's about holding them open long enough for others to step through. And when they try to belittle you, when they laugh or roll their eyes, or use words like dramatic, intense, too political, not a team player, remember Jasmine. Remember what they said to her. Remember how they tried to reduce her to lashes, to gloss, to fashion, and how she turned it into fire, into legislation, into legacy. Remember how they mocked Section B6 and she gave it a face. Remember that dignity is not what you wear, it's what you refuse to remove. And remember that silence is never neutral. Silence is what allows injustice to rest, recover, and reload. So don't be silent. Don't be small. Don't wait for permission to take up space. You've already earned it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, passed a law that let police arrest immigrants on sight. No judge, no warrant, just suspicion. Then innocent Americans started vanishing, detained for their skin color, their accent, their silence. That's when Jasmine Crockett stepped in and uncovered a $24 million contract tied to detention quotas in Abbott's own financial network. The fallout shook everything: public trust, state policy, and the lie they built it all on. Was this ever about border security? Or did Greg Abbott turn human suffering into a business plan? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Texas in early summer wasn't just hot, it was punishing. The kind of heat that made the air taste like metal, that turned parking lots into ovens, that made breath itself feel heavy, like breathing through smoke. In towns along the southern border, rows of white buses lined up like military convoys. Engines running, windows blacked out, humanity caged behind glass. Greg Abbott had just signed an executive order. Dozens of buses packed with undocumented migrants, shipped to Democrat sanctuary cities. CNN flashed the headline in red. Fox called it a bold defense of state rights. The governor called it a humanitarian act. But the images told a different story. Toddlers crying into their mothers' shirts, elderly men clutching medicine bottles, teenagers with shoelaces removed and wrists zip-tied. It didn't look like humanitarian aid. It looked like a purge. Jasmine Crockett, congresswoman from Texas's 30th district, didn't wait for the headlines to cool. By the time Abbott stood at his podium, Jasmine had already stepped in front of a dozen microphones in Dallas. "What he's doing," she said with measured rage, "is turning human lives into political cargo." She wasn't a governor. She didn't have riot police or state funding. What she had was history. She had once spent the night inside the Texas Capitol, refusing to leave until lawmakers read out loud the full text of a bill designed to suppress minority voters. She had been tear-gassed during protests, censored on the House floor, told to act like a lady more times than she could count. And still, here she stood, unmoved, unafraid. Abbott claimed his buses were compassion in motion. Jasmine called them what they were: political theater, written in pain, driven by cruelty. Reporters fell silent. The nation watched. Behind Jasmine, the footage rolled. Faces pressed against windows, hands clutching rosaries. A little girl mouthing one desperate word: "Mommy." Jasmine didn't blink. "This isn't about safety," she said. "It's about dehumanization. And Texas has seen enough of that in its history." Her voice didn't shake. Her stare didn't drop. In that moment, she wasn't just speaking for migrants. She was speaking for every person who'd ever been told they were expendable. And so the question pierced the humid Texas air, hung above every headline, whispered through every newsroom, repeated on every talk show. Can a black woman, without a badge, without a state house, without an army, take on the most powerful man in Texas and win? She dug into the text like a surgeon searching for a tumor, knowing something poisonous had to be hiding beneath the surface. And there it was, nestled inside the sterile phrasing of the State Emergency Immigration Enforcement Act. A single clause that read like it belonged in the pages of a dystopian thriller. Not a democratic state's law book. It granted sweeping power to Texas State Police, the power to detain any individual they merely suspected of being in the country unlawfully. No warrant required, no court order, no obligation to notify federal authorities. It was unilateral judgment, executed on sight. The language was maddeningly vague, like a trap written in fog. What exactly counted as reasonable suspicion? Who decided it? What did suspicion look like to a tired patrol officer working a double shift in 110-degree heat? Was it the color of someone's skin, a Spanish accent, a hoodie, a pause too long before answering in English? That's all it took. A glance, a whisper. And suddenly, your life could be swallowed by the state. But the horror wasn't just in the words. The true terror came after, when the law's consequences began to bleed into real lives. Jasmine's phone rang one night at 11:47 p.m. A young organizer from San Antonio was sobbing on the other end. A man named Diego Morales, a U.S. citizen, a Marine Corps veteran, father of two, born and raised in El Paso, had just been arrested at a gas station for loitering near the border. His only crime, forgetting his wallet at home. No ID, no phone, no rights apparently. He was thrown into a holding cell without explanation, left there for 3 days, ignored, unnamed, forgotten, until someone ran his fingerprints and realized they had caged a war hero. In McAllen, a 63-year-old grandmother with arthritis and a laminated citizenship card was zip-tied in front of her crying grandchildren. The officer reportedly told her, "These could be fake. We've seen worse." And in Dallas, a high school junior delivering Uber Eats after class was detained and sent to ICE custody because he answered a question in broken English. Jasmine didn't need to imagine these stories. They flooded her inbox, her voicemails, her soul, one after another, like water over a dam ready to break. She didn't see mistakes. She saw design. She saw how the law had been engineered, not to protect, but to profile. How a phrase as slippery as reasonable suspicion could be turned into a loaded gun, placed in the hands of anyone wearing a badge, and a bias. She saw clearly what others refused to admit, that in the eyes of this policy, your very existence could be criminalized. If your skin wasn't pale enough, your English wasn't perfect enough, or your paperwork wasn't flawless enough. This wasn't about national security. It wasn't about border control. It was about fear, the weaponization of it, the political exploitation of it, the legal insulation of it. The law had not failed. It had worked exactly as designed. To Greg Abbott, it was a tactic. To Jasmine Crockett, it was a state-approved license for racial targeting, a smokescreen of public safety wrapped around systemic injustice. And the deeper she looked, the more undeniable the truth became. This was never just about immigration. This was about control, about who is seen, who is erased, and who is free to walk away untouched. In Jasmine, she had no intention of walking away, not this time, not ever. And when silence became complicity, Jasmine knew. There was only one place left to take the fight, straight to the floor of Congress, under oath in front of the cameras, with the truth laid bare for the entire nation to hear. The hearing room was packed so tightly that even the air felt charged, thick with the kind of tension you could almost hear. Rows of reporters hunched over their notepads. Congressional aides hovered at the edges, whispering into hidden earpieces. The marble walls seemed to lean inward, magnifying every breath, every shifting shoe, every clicking camera lens. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, framed in the bright, pitiless lights of the C-SPAN cameras. She wore a navy suit sharp enough to cut glass, her crucifix chain barely visible at her collar, her hands steady as they rested on a thick folder, brimming with names and faces. She didn't shuffle papers. She didn't look around for support. She stood like a verdict already rendered. And when the chairman finally gave her the floor, she didn't waste a second. Her voice rang out, clean and fierce, slicing through the static. This is not immigration enforcement. This is racial profiling, given a badge and a license to hunt. She opened the folder with deliberate slowness, pulling out a photo. Diego Morales, Marine Corps veteran, wrists zip-tied, slumped against a patrol car, still wearing his Veterans of Foreign Wars cap. She held it high, above the microphone, where every lens could see it. Gasps erupted on the Democratic side of the aisle. Uncomfortable shifting filled the Republican side. Jasmine's face did not flinch. Her voice was measured, like a surgeon making the first incision. When skin color becomes reasonable suspicion, we are not enforcing the law. We are enforcing fear. She placed the photo down, only to lift another. A teenage boy in a delivery uniform, hands cuffed behind his back, his Uber Eats bag tossed on the ground like trash. Another click of a photo, another life detained without cause, another scar left by a policy dressed up as public safety. The rhythm of her delivery was relentless, not rushed, an unfolding indictment that grew heavier with every documented injustice. The chamber began to shift, subtle at first, like the first groan of steel before a bridge collapses. Jasmine leaned closer to the microphone now, her words slowing, sharpening, building towards something no one in that room would be able to forget. "Let's be clear," she said, her voice deepening, cracking through the pretense of civility that coated the room like cheap paint. "When the color of your skin becomes the reason you are stopped, questioned, stripped of your freedom, or simply made to vanish behind bars, that is not public safety. That is not law enforcement. That is terror, state-sponsored, uniformed, and paid for by taxpayers." She let the words hang there, heavy, brutal. No one dared move. Even her political enemies sat frozen, caught in the blast radius of a truth too raw to sidestep. She could have ended there. She could have let the silence carry her point. But Jasmine wasn't there for applause. She wasn't there to win a soundbite. She was there to make sure that every American watching, whether in the living rooms of Dallas, the bodegas of Brooklyn, or the dusty fields outside El Paso, understood exactly what was at stake. She straightened her back, fixed her gaze squarely into the heart of the camera lens, and delivered the line that would shatter the country's delusion of distance. When the law is used to arrest vulnerable people, and the police use their power to do wrong, that's not about keeping order anymore. That's oppression. And when oppression shows up, it doesn't ask for permission. It breaks in, kicks down the door, and destroys people's lives. And just like that, the room wasn't merely listening, it was holding its breath. But not everyone in power wanted to hear the truth Jasmine had spoken under oath. And within hours, the backlash came. Loud, calculated, and broadcast to millions. The attack didn't come from a press release. It came from prime time. Fox News, 8 p.m. sharp. The slot reserved for red meat headlines and rhetorical fireworks. Governor Greg Abbott sat center frame, backlit in patriotic blue, an American flag draped conveniently behind his shoulder. His tie was perfectly knotted, his expression perfectly measured. The headline across the screen read, "Governor responds to radical race accusations." And the host, grinning like he'd already read the script, asked, "What do you make of Congresswoman Crockett's explosive testimony today?" Abbott didn't blink. "I'll tell you what I make of it," he said. "This isn't about protecting migrants. This is about pushing a narrative. Jasmine Crockett isn't fighting for justice. She's manufacturing outrage. She's a professional race baiter, a fire starter, looking for a stage." He paused long enough to let the insult soak in. "This isn't civil rights," he smirked. "This is show business, and she's doing it with taxpayer dollars." Within 30 seconds, the clip had been chopped and circulated by every major conservative blog in the country. It flooded Facebook feeds. It exploded on Twitter. Conservative influencers turned it into a slogan. Crockett lies, Texas pays. Hashtags followed, memes followed. But what followed for Jasmine was something darker, more personal. Her office received thousands of messages in a single night. Some were just insults. Others were threats. "Keep your mouth shut. Stay in your lane. Watch your back." And across it all, the same pattern pulsed underneath. She had told the truth, too clearly, too boldly, and the system had responded the only way it knew how. Not by answering her claims, but by attacking her character. The hardest part wasn't the smear campaign, Jasmine had weathered storms before. What hit hardest was the quiet betrayal. Colleagues who had clapped behind closed doors now refused to be seen near her on the House floor. Former allies, people she had defended, vouched for, even protected, suddenly had scheduling conflicts when cameras appeared. Staffers averted their eyes in the hallway. Journalists who once begged for quotes now quoted ABBOTT instead. Governor defends law against activist attack, one article read. Congresswoman accused of fueling racial division, read another. The narrative was shifting, and Jasmine was being buried beneath it, not because she was wrong, but because she was too right, too fast, too visible. She knew what this was. This wasn't a debate, it was retaliation, the oldest kind. The kind used when a black woman dared to speak without trembling. The kind used when someone told a truth that couldn't be denied. So they tried to make her the lie instead. They wanted to make her name radioactive, make her too risky to stand beside, isolate her, drown her in noise, silence her by shaming her voice. It wasn't new, it wasn't clever, but it was still happening. In 2025, on national television, with the state's highest office holder calling her a fraud for refusing to stay quiet. But words alone couldn't expose what was hidden behind government fences and bureaucratic lies. So Jasmine did what no one expected. She went to see it with her own eyes. The road to the El Paso facility was dry and unmarked, paved in dust and denial. Jasmine drove alone, the sky just beginning to lighten over the desert horizon, casting long orange streaks across the windshield, like scars. Her suit was gone. In its place, jeans, a plain gray polo shirt, and a borrowed badge clipped to her chest, reading Community Support Liaison. It was fake, but convincing enough to get her through 2 security checkpoints with barely a glance. No one looked twice. They never did. When the visitor was quiet, female, and looked like she was just there to check boxes, a guard handed her a clipboard, waved her toward the intake bay. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't care. He didn't see a congresswoman walking in. He saw someone he could ignore. And that was exactly what Jasmine needed, to disappear into the system. The warehouse was massive. Low ceilings, flickering fluorescent lights, and a smell that stuck to the lungs. Bleach, urine, metal, sweat. She walked past rows of chain-link enclosures. Not rooms, not cells, but cages. Some were packed with adult men sitting shoulder to shoulder on the floor, wrists still bound with plastic cuffs. Others held families, mothers curled around infants, teenagers pacing like caged animals, trying to remember what fresh air felt like. The noise was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the hum of resignation, the sound of people who had stopped asking if anyone was coming to help. Then came the children, dozens of them, maybe more. Some no older than 5 or 6, huddled under thin aluminum blankets that crinkled like candy wrappers when they moved. Their shoes had been taken. Some had no socks. A few wore only oversized shirts and underwear. Their eyes, wide, hollow, watching Jasmine as she walked by, like they weren't sure if she was real. And then came the voice that would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was a little girl's voice, soft, hoarse, barely audible beneath the humming light. Can you tell them, I just want to see my mom? The child couldn't have been older than 6. Her fingers gripped the fence like it was the only thing holding her to earth. Jasmine stopped mid-step. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't have an answer. There was no promise she could make in good faith. No way to fix it in that second. She knelt down slowly until her eyes met the girl's through the chain link. She didn't speak. She just looked at her and nodded gently, as if to say, I hear you. I won't forget you. And that was all she could give. What the girl didn't know was that Jasmine's glasses weren't just for vision. Hidden behind the frame was a micro lens, blinking silently, recording everything. The cages, the zip ties, the barefoot children, the guards laughing at their phones, the water fountain with no water, the clock that didn't work. She moved through the facility like a ghost, invisible but fully awake, documenting every injustice with the calm of someone whose anger had evolved into purpose. She didn't cry, not there, not yet. She had learned long ago that tears could wait, but truth couldn't wait. She passed by a mother who hadn't been allowed to call her husband in 2 weeks, a teenage boy with blood on his shirt and no medical attention, a toddler crying alone in a cage labeled unaccompanied minor 47. She burned every detail into memory, every face, every smell, every sound. She stayed as long as she could without raising suspicion. Then she walked out the same way she came in, through the side gate, past the empty parking lot, back into the silence of the morning heat. But something had changed, because somewhere between those barbed wire fences and the silence of the outside world, a question had taken root and refused to die. Does justice still live here, on this border, in this country, in this century? And when no one in power answered that question, Jasmine knew what she had to do next: walk into the fire and ask it live in front of the entire nation. The CNN studio had the shine of neutrality, polished floors, soft blue backlights, a news ticker crawling calmly at the bottom of the screen. But nothing about this night was calm. Everyone watching knew it. This wasn't just a panel. It was a confrontation, a collision between two visions of America. Jasmine Crockett sat at the far end of the glass table, dressed in black, composed, but every line in her posture radiated control under pressure. Across from her, Governor Greg Abbott looked every bit the statesman, clean-cut, practiced, calm, but behind his carefully measured smile, there was tension. The host opened the segment with mild introductions, but no one was really listening. Viewers at home weren't here for pleasantries. They were waiting for fire. Abbott struck first. "The people of Texas are overwhelmed," he began, voice steady, confident. "We are dealing with an uncontrolled flow of illegal immigration. Border towns are stretched to their breaking point. Resources are depleted. Our citizens are at risk. This isn't just a policy issue, it's an invasion." The word dropped like a grenade. He repeated it again, slower this time. "An invasion." The host nodded slightly, as if it were a term everyone had quietly agreed upon. Cameras zoomed in. Abbott folded his hands. It was clear he believed he had delivered the decisive blow. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She waited, letting his words hang in the air, like smoke. And then, without raising her voice, without even changing her expression, she spoke, with a force that rewired the room. "You call it an invasion," she said, "but what I see, what I just saw, are women with toddlers sleeping on concrete. What I see are children crying behind fences, barefoot, dehydrated, with no one coming for them. And you, standing here, calling them enemies of the state." Abbott shifted slightly. Not much, but enough. Jasmine leaned in. "Do you know what it's like to sit in front of a 6-year-old girl and hear her ask, 'Can someone tell them I just want to see my mom?' And then walk away because no one in your administration will give her an answer?" Her voice didn't shake, but the silence around her did. "You call that security?" she asked. "You think the state of Texas is being attacked by frightened families running from gang violence and famine? Then maybe it's not the border that's broken. Maybe it's your definition of humanity." The host looked down, fumbling with a note card. Abbott opened his mouth, but Jasmine wasn't finished. "Let's be clear," she said, her voice slicing through the static like a scalpel. "You're not overwhelmed. You're not under attack. What you are is on camera. And you've decided to use human suffering as your platform because scaring people is easier than solving problems." Her hand reached under the desk, produced a printed still, an image from her hidden camera footage. It showed the child, pressed against the cage, holding her hands up to no one. Jasmine slid the photo across the table, right in front of Abbott. "Look at her," she said. "Say it again. Look at that little girl, and say she's the threat." Ah. And just when the air felt like it couldn't hold one more ounce of tension, Jasmine reached into her folder, pressed a button on the remote, and let the truth speak louder than anything she could ever say. The remote in Jasmine's hand felt small, almost weightless, as she pressed the button without fanfare. The studio lights dimmed slightly. The massive screen behind the debate desk blinked once, then filled with raw, grainy footage. At first, the images stuttered, shaky, handheld, imperfect. But then they sharpened. Brutally real, rows of children, wrapped in crinkled aluminum blankets. Tiny hands, gripping cold chain-link fences from the inside. A boy no older than 7, with matted hair, barefoot, tracing circles in the dirt with his toe, because he had nothing else to do. No narration, no edits, just silence, broken only by the distant sounds of crying, the low mechanical hum of an industrial fan, and the unmistakable clang of metal doors slamming shut. Each image stayed on the screen, just long enough to brand itself into every mind watching. The room shifted, not obvious at first, just a slight inhale, a shuffle of feet, a hand twitching toward a mouth in disbelief. Then came the second wave, heads turning toward each other wide-eyed. And then someone stood. A woman in the audience, clutching a notepad to her chest, rose slowly and began to clap. A man next to her followed. Within seconds, the left side of the studio rose to their feet. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor. Hands met hands, slapping harder, faster, as if trying to physically force the truth into existence. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind that fades after a moment. It was desperate, raw, almost angry, the kind of clapping that comes from a place too deep for words. Jasmine didn't move. She sat still, letting the storm build around her, her hands resting calmly on the table. Abbott stayed rigid in his seat, his jaw locked, his knuckles whitening, gripping the arms of his chair. The footage rolled on. Women sleeping on concrete under fluorescent lights, a toddler wailing into the crook of an older sister's arm, a boy with a bloodied nose pressing his forehead to the steel bars for comfort. In one frame, a makeshift water fountain taped over with a crude cardboard sign reading, "Out of order." In another, a guard laughing, while a teenage girl wept silently in a corner. No voiceover, no spin, only the brutal simplicity of a reality too ugly to dress up. The host tried to speak, clearing his throat into the microphone, mumbling something about perspectives and national security. But the noise drowned him out. The cameras kept rolling. The producers didn't cut away. Because for the first time in a very long time, the truth was more compelling than the narrative. And it wasn't Abbott dictating the headlines now. It was Jasmine Crockett, without raising her voice, without pointing a finger, without needing to say a single additional word. Finally, as the footage ended and the applause settled into a heavy, stunned quiet, Jasmine turned her gaze, not to Abbott, not to the host, but directly into the main camera lens. The lens broadcasting live to millions of homes across America. Her voice, when it came, was low even, but sharp enough to slice through the steel walls people built around their conscience. "If this is what protecting our borders means," she said, gesturing to the empty screen, "then maybe the real danger isn't out there. It's already inside." No one moved, no one spoke. The room, for one long moment, simply existed, in the truth she had dropped at their feet. Heavy, undeniable, burning a hole straight through the spin. But as the applause faded and the cameras powered down, Jasmine couldn't shake the question echoing in her gut. Who was making money off this misery? So she followed the trail, quietly, methodically, straight into the belly of something darker than she had imagined. Jasmine didn't sleep that night. The images from the detention center replayed in her mind. But they were no longer just images of human suffering. They were questions, numbers, transactions. Something didn't add up. There was too much coordination, too much efficiency, in the cruelty. So while the rest of the city slept, Jasmine sat in her office with a pot of black coffee and a legal pad full of questions. She logged into public procurement databases, scanned state contracts, cross-referenced vendors connected to border enforcement, and that's when she found it. A single contract, buried under 3 layers of bureaucratic language. A line item labeled Emergency Housing Tier 2 Oversight, Disbursement Schedule Attached. The amount was enormous, $8.4 million. Wired to a company no one had heard of, Centurion Logistics Group. No website, no press releases, just a business address tied to a shipping container rental company outside Houston. To anyone else, it might have looked like an obscure contractor, but to Jasmine, who had spent years dissecting fraudulent nonprofit networks, it looked like a shell, and she knew that shells always had something inside. The more she dug, the uglier it got. Centurion wasn't just running the facilities. They were billed by the body, per person, per night, with incident surcharges added for so-called disruptions, legal delays, language issues, transport reassignments. The longer someone stayed locked up, the more Centurion got paid. A child with no court date? Profit. A father denied phone access? Profit. A mother transferred 3 times in 4 days? More profit. It wasn't about moving people through the system. It was about keeping them inside it for as long as possible. And behind Centurion, a real estate holding trust, then a capital fund, then buried in SEC filings and quarterly ownership disclosures. Lone Granite Holdings, a private fund operated by 3 major Texas donors with long histories of political contributions. Jasmine's hands went cold. She flipped back to the original disclosure reports, and there it was, in fine print. Governor Greg Abbott's blind trust held indirect equity in Lone Granite Holdings. Not metaphorical, not speculative, real, legal, financially reportable. Abbott had a personal financial stake in the very company profiting from migrant detention. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a weapons factory. Jasmine sat in silence. The air in the room felt heavier now, not because of the heat, but because of what she knew. The governor of Texas wasn't just implementing a policy, he was benefiting from it, directly, repeatedly. While families were torn apart, while children were locked in cages, while mothers were forced to give birth in custody without medical care, his investment accounts were growing, quietly, legally, in plain sight. And no one had stopped it. The injustice wasn't just in the arrests, it was in the architecture of the system. The law had been written to look like enforcement, but underneath it was all about money. Every name on a booking slip, another $sign, every delay, every processing backlog, every missing translator, intentional, designed, profitable. It was almost 3 a.m. when she saw it, buried in the middle of a dry internal audit marked restricted internal use. At first glance, it looked like just another government purchase order, the kind she'd already seen dozens of. But something about the formatting was off. The margins were uneven. The title rushed, typed in all caps, Emergency Procurement Authorization. No seals, no department signatures, just 3 lines, and a final figure that nearly made her drop her pen. $24 million. Her eyes moved back to the line above it. Waiver of competitive bidding, approved under Executive Order 982-B. That's when her stomach dropped. This wasn't a normal contract. This was fast-tracked, off the books, written to avoid every legal safeguard in place. She clicked into the metadata. The file had been created at 2:41 a.m., signed electronically by a mid-level operations officer, and approved without a single note from the Procurement Review Board. No deliberation, no oversight, no record. It was like the contract had been conjured out of thin air, passed from hand to hand like a hot secret, all under the cover of darkness. Jasmine zoomed in on the vendor field. The name hit her like a punch. Centurion Logistics Group, the same firm. She had already connected to the detention camps, the per-head payment structure, and Governor Abbott's indirect financial interests. But this time, it wasn't about gradual corruption. It was a direct injection of state money, signed overnight, with no oversight. The normal rules hadn't been bent. They had been erased. She read the contract again, slower this time, line by line. The justification section, only 3 sentences. Due to rapidly escalating conditions at border detention sites and the urgent need for enhanced containment capacity, the Office of the Governor authorizes emergency allocation to designated vendor to ensure continuity of operations. No details, no description of services, no timeline, no accountability. It was the vaguest language she had seen in years of reviewing government documents. It didn't even attempt to look legitimate, because it didn't have to. The system had made space for this kind of move, a window of total power, dressed up in the language of emergency, and Abbott had taken it. She ran her fingers down to the bottom of the PDF, where it listed the payment schedule. An initial disbursement of $4 million had already cleared within 2 hours of the file being created. Jasmine cross-referenced it with Treasury movement reports. Confirmed. It had gone through without a single flag. No one had stopped it. No one had even questioned it, because the people meant to question it had been cut out of the process completely. That was the brilliance of it. The cruelty was obvious, but the silence, that was engineered. Jasmine sat back in her chair, the document open on one screen, her notes on the other, and just stared. This wasn't just a contract. It was a signal. It told her everything about how far the corruption reached, how deep it went, and how confident Abbott and his allies were that no one would look, no watchdogs, no whistleblowers, no internal dissent. They had built a channel wide enough to pour $24 million through it in the middle of the night, and not one person had tried to plug the hole. And in a voice low, shaking but full of steel, she whispered the words, as if confessing them to the air. Now I understand why he wants to arrest as many people as possible. Every detained child is a revenue stream for his friends. She had whispered it into the dim light of her office, not for the world, but for herself. A confession, a verdict, a wound named out loud, but the world heard it anyway. The clip first surfaced in the early hours of morning, posted by a congressional staffer who had been in the hearing room, stunned by what they'd witnessed. It was uncut, raw, and terrifyingly calm. Jasmine Crockett standing before the congressional panel, holding up government documents with one hand and a photograph of a zip-tied child in the other. Her voice didn't rise. Her face didn't twist in anger. She simply laid out the truth, step by step, line by line, until she reached the moment where silence wasn't enough. Every detained child is a revenue stream for his friends. The internet didn't just react, it erupted. Within an hour, the clip had passed 1 million views. It was reposted by teachers, by nurses, by veterans, by celebrities, by exhausted mothers who watched it at their kitchen tables with coffee going cold in their hands. By the end of day 1, it had crossed 10 million. Day 2, 35 million. By the third day, it had exceeded 50 million views and counting, blasting across every major platform like a national siren no one could shut off. The hashtags followed, fast and furious. Justice at the border. Abbott profits from pain. Children are not currency. And then came the remixes. Clips cut with drone footage of detention camps, black and white photos of civil rights protests from 1965 spliced with Jasmine's voice, TikToks from high schoolers quoting her line with fire in their eyes. Veterans stitched the clip with their own testimonies. I fought overseas and came home to this? Lawyers began duetting with annotated breakdowns of the contracts she exposed. A Texas nurse posted a video that simply said, "If I'm treating children like patients and he's treating them like profit, who's the criminal?" The media split in half, fractured cleanly along ideological fault lines. Fox News was first to pounce. By that evening, they ran a headline in red. Congresswoman accuses Texas of child for cash scheme. The following hour, pundits rotated across the screen. Reckless, hysterical, fabricated outrage. One host stared straight into the camera and said, "Jasmine Crockett doesn't want justice. She wants chaos. This is treasonous." By the time their primetime anchors took the stage, the label had escalated to traitor, but not all networks followed that lead. MSNBC aired the full 14-minute segment from the hearing, uncut, uninterrupted. Then they ran an hour-long special comparing Jasmine's documents to previous whistleblower cases, contractor invoices, and state-level executive orders. Rachel Maddow closed her show with a simple sentence that burned across the screen. "This isn't a story about policy. It's a story about profit, and one woman brave enough to tell it." Jasmine didn't sleep that night. Her inbox flooded with death threats, press inquiries, and letters from pastors, school children, and retired judges. Her voicemail filled with everything from prayers to rage to confessions. "My niece was in that camp," one message said. "She hasn't spoken in 6 months. Thank you for showing them we're not invisible." But what came next couldn't be muted. Not by smear campaigns, not by talking points, not by silence. In Austin, outside the governor's mansion, the first protest began with just 6 people. By sunset, there were 600. By the next morning, 6,000. They brought signs, hand-painted, handwritten, unpolished but furious. One read, "My child is not your business model." Another, "Children aren't inventory. Shut it down." And the one that made the front page of the New York Times, held by a woman with her toddler asleep in her arms, read, "My daughter is not your revenue stream." They chanted Jasmine's name, not in adoration, but in alignment, because she hadn't just told the truth. She had named the system, she had named the price, and for the first time, the system couldn't look away. From Lubbock to Los Angeles, teachers rewrote civics lessons. Universities live-streamed the hearing in ethics courses. Art students painted Jasmine's words on brick walls and abandoned buildings. Every detained child is a revenue stream for his friends. Her line, born in rage, uttered in exhaustion, had become a national mirror. And the reflection wasn't pretty. Inside the governor's press office, aides scrambled to contextualize the contracts. They called it a mischaracterization, a misreading, a misunderstanding. But the people outside weren't listening to spin anymore. They had already seen the footage, read the fine print, heard the numbers. They weren't protesting an idea. They were protesting a system that had finally been caught on camera. And standing at the center of it all was Jasmine, flawed, exhausted, unshaken. She hadn't gone viral to become a symbol. She'd gone public because someone had to. And the country, whether it liked it or not, was now listening. But viral outrage wasn't enough. Not if the system was to be held accountable in the daylight. Jasmine knew the next battle had to take place where the powerful were used to silence, not truth, the House chamber. The hearing was called under emergency rules. It was standing room only by 7 a.m., 2 hours before it was set to begin. Journalists crowded the aisles with shoulder-mounted cameras. Staffers moved like nervous sparks between rows of lawmakers. Protesters gathered outside the Capitol steps, chanting beneath banners that read, "Justice at the border is justice for us all." But inside room 217 of the Rayburn House office building, Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all, flanked not by political allies but by files. Boxes of them, thick binders labeled evidence, contracts, correspondence, financial disclosures. Next to those, USB drives, hard drives, laptops. And at the very top of the pile, a black binder marked only with one word: witnesses. When the gavel struck wood, the room dropped into silence like a stage play, seconds from impact. Jasmine rose slowly. She didn't pound the table. She didn't speak in anger. Her voice was cold, clear, and surgical. "This is not a debate," she began. "This is a presentation of fact." She clicked a remote. The monitors behind her lit up, first with a spreadsheet, then a financial transaction, then a line from the now infamous emergency contract, $24 million, awarded without bid at 2:41 a.m. She continued, "We will present government documents, video footage, internal correspondence, and testimony from first-hand witnesses. This hearing will address whether public funds were used to enrich private partners through the detention of innocent people, including children. and whether those profits trace back to elected office. The name she didn't need to say hung in the air like a thundercloud. Governor Greg Abbott had been formally invited to appear. The committee had sent 3 letters, including one marked urgent. Compulsory testimony recommended. But that morning, Abbott's office had issued a public statement. He would not attend. His reason? A classified emergency briefing on border security required his full attention. Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply raised her eyes to the panel and said, "If a governor believes he is too important to answer to the law, then it is the law itself that is dying." The chamber held its breath. What followed was not a political circus. It was a prosecution without courtroom walls. Jasmine played the hidden video footage first. Children in chain-link pens, guards laughing at sobbing teenagers, a boy trying to wash his face from a broken water fountain, marked out of order. The sound played through speakers without edit, without commentary. The room went dead still. Then came the witnesses. First, a financial compliance officer who had worked for Centurion Logistics. She testified that the company billed the state in padded invoices, extra supervision fees for unaccompanied minors who were left alone for hours. Then a procurement whistleblower who revealed the pressure she faced to fast-track emergency contracts without delay or internal review. Her voice shook. Her hands did not. She finished her testimony by laying a printed email on the desk. The subject line read, "Governor's Office approval. No board needed. Move forward." But it was the third witness who broke the nation. He was quiet at first. A young man, early 30s, hair cropped close, hands clasped too tightly in his lap. He had been a detention officer in El Paso. His name was Luis Arriola. He looked like someone who had swallowed a secret so long it had become part of his spine. Jasmine welcomed him gently, asked for his name, his role, his tenure. Then she asked, "Mr. Arriola, can you tell us about the hygiene conditions you witnessed for minors held in Centurion-run facilities?" At first he hesitated, then he nodded. "There wasn't enough water," he said. "Not for drinking, definitely not for showers. There were days when we had to rotate kids in groups, 10 at a time, just to rinse off with cold water from a pipe in the wall." He paused, trying to hold it in. "Sometimes we didn't even have that. Sometimes we told them to wipe down with napkins, paper towels, whatever was there." The room went quiet again. And then he broke. Luis covered his face, shoulders heaving. His next words came through tears. "We had little girls, 7, 8 years old, crying and begging not to be told to shower in groups with the boys. But we had no choice. No curtains, no doors, no privacy. I'm not supposed to say this, but I can't keep pretending it didn't happen." A collective exhale rippled through the room, part rage, part heartbreak. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let the silence stretch, let his tears speak louder than any soundbite. Then she turned to the panel, voice low and razor sharp. "You've just heard a first-hand account of children being stripped of dignity, of safety, of the most basic human decency. And still, no investigation has begun. Still, no charges have been filed. Still, not a single executive responsible for funding this machine has been held accountable." She walked to the center of the chamber floor, held up a still image from the footage. A barefoot child sitting in a wet shirt, head down, on a concrete slab. "This," Jasmine said, "is what emergency border response looks like in the state of Texas. Funded by taxpayers, enriched by investors, protected by silence." The room didn't move. It didn't need to, because what had just been spoken couldn't be unheard. And the system, for the first time in years, had been forced to look directly at itself, without turning away. The witness had barely left the stand when the ripples turned tidal, because what Jasmine unleashed in that hearing chamber wasn't just public outrage. It was a signal, and in Washington, signals carry weight. By the following Monday morning, the seal of the U.S. Department of Justice was projected behind the podium in a room packed with flashing cameras. The press conference was brief, surgical, and history-making. A senior official from the DOJ's Public Integrity Section stepped forward, flanked by investigators and legal counsel. The nation held its breath as she spoke. Based on newly released testimony, verified financial records, and a formal request from the House Oversight Subcommittee, she said, the Department of Justice is opening a federal investigation into the financial ties between state officials and privately operated detention facilities, including but not limited to the office of Governor Greg Abbott. The words felt like an earthquake tearing through the foundations of power. She continued, the scope of the investigation will focus on executive-level decision-making, contract disbursement procedures, and investment activity linked to Centurion Logistics Group and Loan Granite Holdings. Then came the final, unmistakable line, we will follow the money. The room erupted. Journalists shouted overlapping questions. Headlines began to write themselves before reporters left the building. DOJ investigates Abbott blared across screens within minutes. Cable networks cut into their regular programming. For the first time in his career, Governor Abbott wasn't driving the narrative. He was the headline. By noon, his response came. Abbott stepped in front of the Texas state flag, surrounded by his loyalists, his eyes defiant. This is a politically motivated witch hunt, he declared, teeth tight behind every syllable. Washington has targeted Texas before. This is just the next chapter in their war on strong states, on border control, on law and order. His voice rose. Let me be clear, I have done nothing wrong. These attacks are nothing but smoke and mirrors from a radical agenda that wants open borders and chaos. He didn't mention the $24 million. He didn't mention the blind trust. He didn't mention the contract signed at 2:41 a.m. Jasmine watched his statement from her office, eyes steady, hands folded. Her team was scattered across 3 rooms preparing responses, fielding interview requests, and drafting press releases. But she didn't move. She waited until Abbott finished his speech, until the reporters had stopped yelling questions he refused to answer. And then she stood, walked calmly to the podium set up for her own scheduled press briefing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't deliver sound bites. She delivered a truth that no one else had dared to say out loud. If the governor has done nothing wrong, she said, then he should welcome this investigation as a chance to clear his name. But if he's afraid of the facts, if he's terrified of what sunlight reveals, then we must ask why. I didn't call for anyone's downfall. I called for transparency. And if he's not afraid of the truth, she paused, letting her words cut through the noise. Then let the American people see it, in broad daylight. That sentence detonated across media platforms. Let the American people see it in broad daylight. It was clipped, quoted, and replayed on every major network. Activists turned it into a rallying cry. Protest signs, T-shirts, even legal scholars began citing it in panel discussions. It was a call to arms, not with anger, but with clarity, not with fire, but with light. Meanwhile, federal investigators got to work. Subpoenas were issued within 48 hours. Treasury records were requested. SEC filings were pulled. Anonymous tips began pouring in, from clerks, from junior contractors, even from former members of Abbott's campaign finance team. A digital forensics team was dispatched to review email servers belonging to Centurion. One line from an internal memo, later leaked to the press, read, "Delay equals dollars, detain longer when possible." As the investigation unfolded, Jasmine remained a lightning rod, hailed as a hero by some, condemned as a threat by others. Fox doubled down, accusing her of weaponizing federal power against state sovereignty. She responded only once, in an interview with the Washington Post, "If telling the truth makes me dangerous, maybe the lie has lasted too long." Inside the halls of Congress, something had shifted. Colleagues who once ignored her now paused when she passed. Allies grew louder. Enemies grew quieter. The air smelled like reckoning. Still, Jasmine never lost focus. Her team continued compiling evidence. More whistleblowers came forward. And across the country, families who had once felt invisible now watched, breathless, as one black woman, unafraid, took on the machine they thought was untouchable. And the question wasn't whether Abbott would fall. The question was how many walls would crumble with him. The subpoenas were still fresh, the documents still being unsealed, when the first crack appeared, not in the courtroom, but in the law itself. It began with a late afternoon bulletin, quiet, clinical, and cold. A 3-line update from the Office of the Attorney General. In light of ongoing federal investigation and material evidence presented before the U.S. House Subcommittee on Oversight, a section of Executive Emergency Order 982-B shall be suspended until further notice. Enforcement policies reliant on this provision are hereby frozen. No press conference, no dramatic announcement, just a legal notice typed in 11-point font that changed the entire landscape of border enforcement overnight. The clause that allowed Texas officials to override federal due process at will, to detain individuals without warrants, delay hearings indefinitely, and warehouse children in cages under security emergencies, was dead in the water. Across the state, enforcement halted like a machine slamming into its own reflection. Courtrooms began to release cases held on shaky grounds. Judges, some hesitant, others relieved, reopened files they'd once fast-tracked to silence. By dawn, a second wave of orders came down. Independent inspections were to begin across all Centurion-managed detention facilities, unannounced and unrestricted. Civil rights attorneys, pediatric health inspectors, and human rights observers descended on the sites like sunlight through broken glass. In McAllen, they found 15 children sharing a single portable toilet behind a sealed chain-link enclosure. In El Paso, they discovered contaminated water tanks next to makeshift showers with no temperature control and zero privacy. In Dilley, a handwritten sign taped to a guard's desk read, "1 roll of toilet paper per cage per day, ration if they act out." Photos leaked. Whistleblowers stepped forward. Reports were filed under federal oath. And yet, Jasmine Crockett did not step to a microphone and declare victory. She refused the national interviews that begged her to smile. She declined the magazine covers that offered to crown her a modern-day Harriet Tubman. She turned down the book deal, the podcast circuit, the panel spots. Instead, she walked into the press room alone, holding a folder no thicker than an inch, labeled only Testimony Update. She stood at the podium with no teleprompter, no entourage, and no script. Just the truth, as steady and heavy as it had always been. "They're not policy changes," she said quietly, "until they reach the people they were written to hurt." A pause. "I'm not here to celebrate partial justice. I'm here to remind everyone watching that we're not done. Because I didn't fight this to win. I fought so no one would ever be locked in silence again because of their skin or their papers. I fought because some lives are made invisible on purpose." The room went still. Journalists leaned forward. She continued, slower now, each word landing like a gavel strike. "Justice isn't when the system adjusts under pressure. Justice is when the system changes so that pressure is no longer needed. Until then, don't call this a victory. Call it a pause in a machine that was never built for mercy." And then she turned, walked out of the room, and left the headlines to follow her shadow. That week, protest signs changed. No longer demanding exposure. They now demanded permanence. Don't pause the machine, break it. This isn't over. We're still watching. Children previously locked in cages now appeared in morning news interviews, sitting beside lawyers, holding stuffed animals and looking out into the flash of cameras. No longer with fear, but with something else. Awareness, language, memory. One 11-year-old girl from Guatemala, now living with an aunt in New Mexico, looked into a reporter's lens and said, "She heard us. I hope someone listens to her." In Congress, political tides shifted quietly but unmistakably. Lawmakers once dismissive of Jasmine's work began echoing her language in subcommittee meetings. The term detention to profit was now used openly on both sides of the aisle. Governors in other border states scrambled to review their own detention contracts. Whispers turned into strategy, and strategy, Jasmine knew, would become the next battlefield. But that night, after the press faded and the crowds dispersed, she sat alone on the Capitol steps under the soft light of a cold sky. Her team had begged her to rest. Her phone buzzed with more texts, more offers, more opportunities. But she silenced it all. Not because she needed quiet, but because she was finally hearing something louder than applause. A question, one that wouldn't leave her, one that lived in the back of her throat like a truth too old to whisper. A question that had followed her from the courtroom, through the cages, through every page of every contract, every bruise on every child, and every time someone had told her, It's just the way things are. And now it rang again, clear as glass breaking. How many systems in this country exist, quietly, invisibly, because the people they hurt are not allowed to speak? But Jasmine never believed justice ended with a gavel or a signature. She knew real change didn't come when a law was suspended. It came when people refused to let silence take hold again. The ripple effect started small, barely visible beneath the surface of politics and polling. A single clause in New Mexico was struck from their enforcement code. A clause that had allowed local officers to detain individuals without checking federal databases. Then Arizona followed, quietly sunsetting a regional detention partnership with Centurion's Western Contractor affiliate. By the end of the month, Colorado's legislature introduced a bill banning any for-profit entity from overseeing the housing or processing of undocumented minors. By the end of the quarter, 6 states were rewriting border enforcement protocols altogether. They didn't mention Jasmine by name, but every policy memo carried her fingerprints. Every red line in a contract, every new requirement for public audits, every mandated mental health counselor for detained children. Her voice, once dismissed as disruptive, had become the template for the future. Meanwhile, Jasmine kept working. No book tour, no campaign ads, no headlines, just her team, and a war room of unglamorous files still being sorted. She traveled to districts that hadn't voted for her, sat in churches she didn't attend, met with sheriffs who had once mocked her. She asked one question in every meeting: what happens when the law is used to wound instead of protect? Some avoided her eyes, some folded their arms, but none left unchanged. And then, one Thursday afternoon in early spring, an envelope arrived in her office. It was folded twice. The return address was scribbled in crayon. No press, no staffer brought it in with an announcement. It was just there, waiting for her. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter written on lined notebook paper, uneven and careful. Dear Ms. Jasmine, my name is Amelia. I was in the El Paso camp. I think I was 6 then. I am 8 now. My teacher said we could write letters to people we remember. I remember your eyes. You didn't say anything that day, but I saw your eyes. You looked at us like we were real. I am in 3rd grade now. I got to hold a pencil with my name on it. I have a bed now too. Thank you for helping me. I still remember. Love, Amelia. Jasmine didn't speak for a full minute. She placed the letter down like glass. Her hands trembled, not because of fear or fury, but because something deeper had settled in her chest. Not closure, not pride, just weight. The kind of weight no law could lift. The kind that no judge, no hearing, no policy revision could ever make disappear. It was the weight of being seen and of seeing. She rose from her desk and looked out her window. Below, the Capitol dome shimmered in the heat. Somewhere in Texas, a governor's office was fighting subpoenas. Somewhere else, children were still crossing deserts barefoot. And in a 3rd grade classroom, a girl who had once known only fences was learning to write her name on paper that no longer carried numbers, barcodes, or custody IDs. Jasmine exhaled, slowly. She knew the cameras would come again, the microphones, the critics. They would ask whether she had won, and she would say what she had always known to be true. I didn't fight to win. I fought so no one would have to live invisible because of their skin, their accent, or a missing document. The country still had walls to tear down, laws to rewrite, truths to name, but that battle would not begin in court. It would begin in every voice brave enough to say, no, no, to cruelty disguised as security. No, to contracts written in the dark. No, to systems that profit from pain. No, to leaders who think the law was built to protect them, not the people. It would begin in a folded letter from a child, in a parent's trembling voice at a town hall, in a worker who refuses to look away, in a lawyer who won't redact her rage, in a congresswoman who never raised her voice, but never backed down. And maybe that's where Jasmine's journey was always meant to live. Not in the chambers of power, but in the echo of every room where someone finally, painfully, stood up and refused to be silent. The courtroom was never the destination. It was just the door. But even after the headlines faded and the hearings turned into archived footage, one truth remained. etched deeper than any policy, any ruling, any signature. But long after the applause stopped and the headlines moved on, one question kept rising, quiet, heavy, unrelenting. What do we do with the truth once we've seen it? Jasmine Crockett never set out to be a symbol. She was a voice, a steady, unshaken refusal in a room built to mute discomfort. What she uncovered wasn't just a corrupt contract or a broken law. It was a truth far more disturbing. That cruelty doesn't always scream. It whispers through policy, smiles through press releases, and hides behind bureaucratic terms like emergency enforcement. The most dangerous part wasn't the cages. It was the silence that surrounded them. A silence built by people who knew, but looked away. And Jasmine's fight wasn't just against a governor or a policy. It was against the normalization of that silence. The lesson is not about left or right. It's about right and wrong. It's about what happens when laws are written to harm the voiceless and systems are designed to profit from their pain. Jasmine stood in the middle of that machine and said one simple word. No. No. To detention for profit. No. To justice wrapped in fine print. No. To a state that measures innocence in dollars. And what made it powerful wasn't the volume. It was the fact that she never blinked. Even when it cost her, even when she stood alone. She didn't claim victory because justice isn't a finish line. It's a choice we make every time we refuse to let someone disappear behind paperwork, borders, or fear. The real battle isn't won in courtrooms. It's won in classrooms, kitchens, and communities. In every place where someone finally decides to stop accepting, that's just how it is. Jasmine didn't dismantle a system in one hearing, but she cracked it. And through that crack, the country saw itself. So what do we do now? We remember her words, we remember the children, and we ask, over and over, until someone answers. How many systems in this country still survive because the people they hurt aren't allowed to speak? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.